Welcome and thank you for attending Black History Matters, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. My name is Victoria Basulto, and I am a current senior at Colgate University, located in Hamilton, New York, as well as a current intern for the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I will be facilitating the series of 28 presentations that will be released throughout the month of February 2021 and that you can view on our YouTube channel or on our website. I will now lead you through some introductory statements. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is located in Peterborough, New York, in the building that you can see on the screen where the inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society was held in 1835. NAHOF's mission is as follows. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. NAHOF has worked in coordination with the Garrett Smith Estate National Historic Landmark, which is also located in Peterborough, New York, to create Black History Matters. The following statement is the purpose of the Black History Matters series. NAHOF supports racial justice movements seeking to address racial inequality, given their resonance with NAHOF's mission to address the second and ongoing abolition to end racism. NAHOF believes a significant number of Americans do not understand the current racial justice protests due to their unfamiliarity with 4 centuries of Black American history, because this history was either excluded or taught inadequately in schools. NAHOF knows that education is a powerful step towards ending racism, and that understanding the history of the enslavement and dehumanization of Black Americans provides critical context for the ongoing racial justice movements and the persistence of racism in America. Given NAHOF's commitment to strengthening knowledge of history as one route to confront racism, NAHOF will present Black History Matters, a series of crash courses covering some examples of neglected topics in Black American history throughout the month of February 2021. I'd like to now introduce our presenter, Ann Jones. Ann Jones is a member of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum's Cabinet of Freedom, where she serves as a secretary as well as membership chair. She also serves as vice president of the 1886 Benevolent Society Board of Managers, as well as on the executive committee of the Madison County Democratic Committee. Ann retired from Madison County Board of Elections, where she served as deputy commissioner for 15 years. She was also a member of the New York State Election Commissioner Association. She received her degree in education from SUNY Cortland and her master's in public administration from Marist College. She lives in Cazenovia, New York with her husband Scott, and one of her favorite roles is that of being a lifetime learner. I'd like to now invite Ann Jones to begin her presentation on John Lewis.
Thank you, and welcome to the NAHOF Black History Month series. As Victoria said, my name is Ann Jones, and I'm honored to talk about Representative John Lewis. This man lived 2 lifetimes in his 80 years on this earth. He was able to create a beautiful legacy, and the benefactors cannot even begin to be tallied. I decided, when I was putting this together, I decided to pull the information together under the title of John Lewis, A Life of Closing Voting Gaps. This was what John Lewis's aspiration, along with many others, but this is the one that I felt I needed to present. This is one of John Lewis's greatest legacies, closing the gap, but also closing the gap on violence. Truly, this section of history runs from his birth in 1940 with the end date of 2020 as he passed away this past July. But really, his legacy and unfinished business will go on for a long time, if not forever. The work of civil awareness is constant and never perfected. We've come a long way, but obviously we have a long way to go. Studying John Lewis and his advocacy and legacy made me question, what is it that makes a person a leader and an advocate? So I looked for definitions of leadership And my favorite definition was a leader is someone who can see how things can be improved, who rally people to move towards a better vision. Leaders can work together, making their vision a reality while putting people first. Just being able to motivate people isn't enough. Leaders need to be empathetic and connect with people to be successful. This definition came from the Chief Learning Officer website, and this is the definition that personifies John Lewis. He creates allies, and these were the very forces that made good trouble a force to be reckoned with. But when we talk about the role of being an advocate, it's to offer independent support to those who feel that they are not being heard, and to ensure that they are taken seriously and that their rights are respected. An advocate does not represent their own view, but amplifies the person they are supporting. John Lewis walked the walk. So just a little bit about John Lewis. He was born on February 21st, 1940 in Alabama. He was the third of 10 children to parents who were sharecroppers. It's reported that John Lewis had very little interaction with white people as a child, but he experienced white people through segregation. That's how he experienced his racism also. He remembers white libraries, black libraries, white drinking fountains, black drinking fountains. Actually, one of his 40 arrests was for using a white man's bathroom. 37 days in prison in Mississippi for using a white man's bathroom. This was while he was a freedom rider in 1961. At age 11, John Lewis visited relatives in Buffalo and experienced a very different scenario of interactions between Black and white people. This trip is referred to in many of his writings, and it actually could be the catalyst for his advocacy. During this time, he was studying in Nashville. He also studied at the Highlanders Folk School, which is a school that was used early on to teach the Appalachian people how to advocate for themselves as the government was coming in and taking land, and eventually evolved into the labor movement and into the civil rights movement and the Black movement. But while he was there, at age 20, he actually ate with white people for the first time in his life. Lewis spoke about this in a writing, and he revealed later that this was the meal in an integrated setting at Highlanders. I was a young adult. I had never eaten a meal in the company of Black and white diners. Highlanders was the place that Rosa Parks witnessed the demonstration of equality that helped inspire her to keep her seat in Montgomery bus just a few weeks after the first visit. It was at that point that he realized, that Rosa Parks realized, that they can coexist with white people. I believe that in order to teach, learn, discuss, inquire about a topic, you have to go back and know a little bit of the history of the topic. So I'm going to go back to the history of voting. I'll make it very brief. John Lewis and his lifelong struggle to close the gap for voters' rights. So in our 245-year history as a country, the right to vote was not addressed for the first 92 years. Almost 1/3 of our voting history was granted only to white men who were 21 and owned land. In 1820, most states, white men did not have to hold property. But in 1868, the 14th Amendment passed, followed by the 15th Amendment in 1970. Both of these amendments were addressed by the presentation by Dr. Hogel, but basically, it established citizenship and voter rights. However, racial barriers to voting were still present. poll taxes, literacy tests, fraud and intimidation were still present. Reminder that women and Native Americans were still denied the right to vote at this point. 1920, women were constitutionally given the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And in 1924, Native Americans were granted the right to vote with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. Early years of John Lewis. In 1959, at the age of 19, John Lewis participated in workshops on nonviolent confrontation while attending college in Nashville, Tennessee. He had trained and led sessions at Highlander Folk School and had participated as a freedom rider in 1961. The path was inspired by Martin Luther King and his teachings. To add to his protest collections, he was also the keynote speaker at the 1963 March on Washington. All this before the age of 24. It was on March 7th, 1965. Lewis was beaten by an Alabama state trooper while attempting to lead an estimated 600 voter right marchers out of Selma by way of Montgomery, and they entered into a violent confrontation known as Bloody Sunday. This incident was captured on TV, and that helped to raise the awareness and the anger and the angst. Lewis spent 2 days in the hospital. His skull was fractured. In the wake of the shocking incident, Lyndon B. Johnson called for a comprehensive voting rights legislation. In a speech to the joint session of Congress, this was on March 15th, 1965. This is a matter of a week after Bloody Sunday. The president outlined devious ways in which election officials denied African American citizens the right to vote. It was March 21st through the 25th. Time frame wise, this is 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday, 1 week after the president spoke, when Lewis joined thousands of others during the Selma to Montgomery voting right march. This time, they were protected by federal troops. The crowd was estimated to have reached 25,000 by the time they reached Montgomery. This 50-mile march grew 10 times in 4 days. The voting rights bill was passed by the Senate by a vote of 77 to 19 on May 26, 1965. Once again, when we go back to the time frame from March to May, this is happening. After a month of debate, the House of Representatives passed the bill by a vote of 333 to 85 on July 9th. Lyndon B. Johnson passed it on August 6, 1965. This act removed barriers to Blacks in the South, banning poll tax, literacy tests, and other measures that effectively prevent African Americans from voting. Finally, opening up the opportunity to vote without restraints. Almost. Lewis continues his work on voter rights, voter registration, public service, and he takes over as executive director of the Voter Education Project, a program of the Southern Regional Council in 1971. The beginning of his political life, April 1977, Lewis makes his first bid for Congress in Atlanta. He lost a runoff, but later that year, President Carter actually tapped him to direct Action, a federal volunteer agency. A few years later, in 1981, Lewis wins his first political office when he's elected as a member of the Atlantic City Council, where he serves until 1986. Why did he leave in 1986? Something greater was happening. On November 4th of 1986, Lewis is elected to Congress representing Georgia's 5th district. This includes quite a bit of the city of Atlanta. He was reelected 16 times, most recently in 2018 without opposition. Only once did he receive less than 70% of the vote. He was respected and admired by his electorate. So let's revisit the Voter Registration Act of 1965 for a minute. 1965, of course, Lewis played a role in that act. But so now this bill has been sitting there active for 20 years. Who'd have thought that Congressman John Lewis would have to revisit this? So the 1965 Act went through with an expiration date of 1970. Congress has amended the Voter Rights Act in 1970, 1975, 1982, 1992, 2006, except for 1992, Congress extended the provision that was tied to the coverage formula, in particular, the pre-clearance requirement. What does the pre-clearance requirement mean? Any municipality that changes voter rights, voter polls sites, any changes to the way voting is done has to be pre-cleared through the federal government. So this is sitting there. John Lewis is now in office, but other legislation had been implemented with the assistance of John Lewis. The NVRA, also known as the NVRA is the National Voter Registration Act, also known as the Motor Voter Act of 1993. Congress enacts the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and it's to enhance voting opportunities for every American. The act has made it easier for Americans to register to vote and to maintain their registration. But this act does one other thing. It also allows the Department of Justice to bring civil action in federal court to enforce its requirements. Up to this point, with a few exceptions, very few exceptions, elections are ran and determined how to be ran by each state. So stated in the Constitution that it was up to the states to decide how voting was going to occur. In federal years, however, meaning even years when Senate, Congress, and presidents are elected, that's when the federal government can move in and make decisions. The other big piece of legislation that John Lewis was a part of was the Help America Vote Act of 2002. We all remember, well, some of us remember Florida in 2000. Remember Chad living there in Florida. Thousands and thousands and thousands of voters were disenfranchised. Their votes were not counted. Because voting is private, you don't know if your vote went through at that point. Back then, Florida had punch cards. And if you didn't punch all the way through and a Chad was hanging, it could be determined to be a non-valid vote. So the Help America Vote Act moved in, and what they did was they created the Election Commission Association, and what they did was set a minimum standard that each state had to follow. So this created new voting systems, new voting administration, silly things like how to get voter information out to the public prior to election day. Not candidate information, but how to vote information. John Lewis was instrumental in all of this. So now we hit 2013. Remember, the Voter Rights Act was passed in 1965 to ensure state and local governments did not pass laws or policies that denied American citizens the equal right to vote based on race. But on June 25th, 2013, the Supreme Court swept away a key provision of this landmark civil rights law in Shelby County versus Holder. Shelby County is a county in Alabama, and they were given permission in federal court in DC to ask to no longer be guided by the federal government when they make changes. The U.S. Department of Justice heard the case, and it was upheld as constitutional. Then Shelby County appealed, and it goes to the Supreme Court. On June 25th, 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that the coverage formula in Section 4B of the Voter Rights Act, which determines which jurisdictions are covered by Section 5, is unconstitutional because it's based on an old formula. As a practical matter, this means of Section 5 is inoperable until Congress enacts a new coverage formula, which the decision by the Supreme Court invited Congress to do. When we're talking about inner city voting, a lot of current ways to push forth voter suppression are by moving poll sites, are by making poll sites not accessible, by making poll sites so huge that there's a 4-hour wait, and in particular in neighborhoods that are of color. These are the type of changes that were occurring in some of the municipalities in the South that had to be pre-approved by the federal court or by the federal government prior to elections. This safe gap is now taken away. The Brennan Foundation or Brennan Center for Justice, which is a think tank that works to build an America that is democratic, just, and free for all, came out with a statement. And the statement was, the Supreme Court's decision is at odds with recent history. The Voting Rights Act was vital in 2012, not just in 1965. For nearly 5 decades, it has been the nation's most effective tool to eradicate racial discrimination in voting. It is still critical today. Last year, Section 5 helped block laws making it harder to vote. There is a path forward. Section 5 stands. Congress now has the duty to upgrade this key protection, ensure that our elections remain free, fair, and accessible for all Americans. Today, we are in a great fight for the future of democracy in the United States. John Lewis also had a statement or a response to the 2013 dismantling of the Voter Rights Act. He stated that the Supreme Court has stuck a dagger in the heart of the Voting Rights Act. Although the court did not deny that voter discrimination still exists, it guts one of the most powerful tools this nation has ever had to stop discriminatory voting practices from becoming law. These justices were never beaten or jailed for trying to register to vote. They have no friends who gave their lives for the right to vote. I want to say to them, come and walk in my shoes. Obviously, John Lewis did not agree with the dismantling. He did go on to say that just hours after the court's decision was announced, Texas said it would immediately implement the same voter ID law declared illegal in the Justice Department. This voter ID law has been pushed around for years and years. How to make it just, how to make it right, and non-discriminatory is the problem. Okay, so what is the result now? So we have the NVRA passed in 1960, or the Voter Rights Act passed in 1965. We have these, the National Voter Rights Act, the Help America Vote Act. So now we have to go back and try to implement the part of the National Voter Rights Act that was taken away in 2013. The year is now 2021. There is still no answer on the books. This is a hot issue. There are beliefs that it's a Democratic plot to overlook the elections, and the Democrats believe that it's a plot to continue to be discriminatory towards races during elections. So what was created by a bipartisan team was the Voter Right Advancement Act. After July 17th, the date of John Lewis's death, the name of it was changed to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And it responds to current conditions in voting today by restoring the full protection of the original bipartisan Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was last reauthorized by Congress in 2006, but gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. So following the Shelby County decision, at this point, 8 years ago, several states passed sweeping voting suppression laws that disproportionately prevent minorities, elderly, and the youth from voting. But this bill provides the tools to address these discriminatory practices and seek to protect Americans' right to vote. It creates new coverage formulas that apply to all states, not just the at-risk South states, and hinges on finding of repeated voting rights violations in the preceding 25 years. Significantly, the 25-year period rolls or continuously moves to keep up with current conditions. So the only states that have a recent record of racial discrimination in voting are covered. When we look at some of the discrimination, it's not just in the South, it's also Native Americans, and it can also be women. States that have repeated and persistent violations will be covered for a period of 10 years. So once again, there's an expiration date of the Advancement Act. But if they establish a clean record moving forward, they can come out of coverage. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act establishes a targeted process for reviewing vote changes in jurisdictions nationwide, focused on measures that have historically been used to discriminate against voters. The process for reviewing changes has also been established, and it's limited to the set of jurisdictions to be covered for result-based violations. This act continues to be presented to Congress and the Senate. It failed to make it both through Congress and the Senate last year. John Ossoff, who was mentored by John Lewis, on his stance for running, said that the Biden administration had said that they would breathe life back into this bill. Once again, there's controversy. One of my favorite tweets by John Lewis was that your vote matters. If it didn't, why would some people keep trying to take it away? John Lewis believed that no matter what, voting is a right, voting is a privilege, and voting must be done. Just prior to his death on July 17th, John Lewis wrote a farewell letter and had it posted in the New York Times. And I cherry picked through that letter. And my favorite part was when he spoke to the youth of today. And he said, when historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burden of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. I'm asking you to go forward in peace and make changes, but most of all, make good trouble. Never accept racist comments and stand your ground. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Ann Jones for that educational presentation. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, Ann Jones has provided a reference list of sources with websites that you can explore to learn more. This reference list will be linked beneath the video in the video description. I will also invite you to fill out a quick survey linked in that same video description, which will help us gather feedback about the specific topic and as well as gather information that will be valuable in the creation of future presentations like this one. Should you have any questions regarding the presentation itself, Ann Jones has made her email available so that you may contact her with any questions or comments that you may have. Additionally, please do contact NAHOF with any questions or if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. NAHOF's contact information is available on the screen. Once again, I'd like to thank Ann Jones for providing a program for Black History Matters. I would also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us on this educational journey. Please remember, we will be releasing a new video each day of this February 2021, and we hope we will see you at our next presentation. Thank you.